The School of Fashion started this 7 years ago, really to start to create conversation about how fashion is this incredible vehicle and has always been this incredible vehicle to advance politics, right? That fashion is political and that people in everyday life have and continue to use fashion for very political means and also for very personal means. People use fashion who have been marginalized by society, who have been put into boxes that don't fit them, in order to claim space for themselves, to feel personally fulfilled, to feel a sense of pride, and also to resist social norms, challenge social conventions, and transform society into a world they want to live in. And so every year for the past 7 years, we've been having this conversation. And the reason that we have this conversation in this class is because most of you are just beginning your education in fashion. Whether you're doing a minor, a module, you're in our fashion design or fashion communication programs, or I know some of you are here because you're doing fashion as an open elective. But however you use fashion, you have an opportunity to advance politics. And so in this lecture series, we really want to celebrate and explore how people have used fashion in this way, because this is a way that you too can use fashion, whether it's in your own work in school, in industry, after school, or just in your everyday life. And to deliver this 7th Diversity Now lecture, we really couldn't have a better speaker. His book just came out. I know those of you in this class read a chapter for today, Fabulous, The Rise of the Beautiful Eccentric by Yale University Press. And our speaker, as you know, is Dr. Madison Moore from Virginia Commonwealth University. He is a DJ, a cultural critic, and an assistant professor in gender and queer studies. And I'm so thrilled that he is here in Toronto and here in Ryerson today to really talk about his work, and his work that is not only trailblazing fashion studies, but that's really helping, I think, everyone understand the incredible power that fashion and clothing and style has to change the world. And so please help me welcome our Diversity Now speaker, Madison Moore. Welcome, Madison.
Thank you. So I'm so excited to be here today to tell you a little bit about my book, Fabulous, the research behind it, as well as a few other bits and bobs. Before we get started, we're gonna change the lights. Yeah. We're gonna change the lights. I'm still gonna thank Dr. Ben-Barry for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here, and as well, Michelle, for all of the organizational bits and bobs.
Figuring out the light situation. It's fine, we're good. We're good? Okay.
Oh, because you're recording.
We're recording, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't, okay. Okay, so when I wrote Fabulous, I had no idea that it would take me really all around the world, which is why I think it's really important that all of us as artists, as writers, as thinkers, create work that comes from the soul, the way that Fabulous did for me. So today, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the journey of the book, the secrets nobody else knows but me, and then we'll explore some of the main ideas in the book. We'll talk about a violin virtuoso and how this particular person does fabulousness. We'll talk about one of my favorite runway categories from a Vogue ball that took place in Paris in 2017. And then I'll show how these ideas have shaped kind of my own approach to Fabulous and how I circulate in the world. Finally, we'll then move to a group activity, which I think we'll hear more about towards the end. Okay, so a note of signposting. When I say the word framework, can I get you to give me your fiercest snap? Okay, wait, not yet. Okay, wait. Framework. That wasn't sassy enough. Framework. Okay, so every time I say framework, I want you to snap, okay? And then the last thing, sort of housekeeping thing, is please do not take any pictures at any time. So I would not be here without my Black gay ancestors. So this is optimistic real-time cultural theory that privileges possibility over impossibility and creative expression over victimhood. Robin Kelly reaches for the utopian, creative possibilities of blackness, as he calls a revolution of the mind. For Kelly, it's important that brown bodies are not simply victimized because of the turbulence and unbridled violence of living while black. The revolution, he imagines, is one of creativity and dreaming. For Kelly, the creative is already a political act. One of the thinkers who has been central to my approach to style as a politic is the black gay cultural critic, Joseph Beam, who in a brilliant article or essay titled "Making Ourselves from Scratch" said that style at best is an attitude, a reaction to oppression, a way of being perceived as less oppressed, a way of feeling attractive when we are deemed unattractive. This passage captures really the heart of what I'm interested in fabulousness, that fabulous people as cultural fugitives or even aesthetic fugitives, folks who flee from systems, structures, and hierarchies that oppress us all, making themselves from scratch every day. Now, I should say that fabulousness is not about money. You do not need a lot of coins and paper and direct deposits to be fabulous. Some of the most fabulous people create magic out of the mundane, and for me, that's the point. One of my favorite examples of the idea of making yourself from scratch that Joseph Beam wrote about in the 80s is a transgender Thai style star who gained notoriety for staging absolutely sickening looks out of thin air. I'm sure you know who it is. Here's just one example. Fabulous people as cultural fugitives or even aesthetic fugitives are these who flee from systems, structures, and hierarchies that oppress us all, making themselves from scratch every day. So these are ideas that I developed in the book Fabulous, The Rise of the Beautiful Eccentric, which came out in April last year on Yale Press. People always ask me if the lips are mine, and all I can say is I'm not telling. It was based on my PhD thesis that I wrote as a graduate student when I was at Yale in American Studies. But a few things happened on graduating Yale during the process of writing the book and transforming what was a dissertation into a book. Number one, I moved to London for 4.5 years. And because my work marries autobiography, that's not the word, autobiography, I don't know what I said. Autobiography, cultural criticism, observation, and interviews. I can't tell you how much the experience of being in London and being in the world shaped the project itself. I knew that I didn't want to write a book that would only be accessible to people with advanced degrees or a fancy education. I certainly didn't want to write a book about queer and marginalized people that included them in the narrative but excluded them from access to the book. That was very important for me in terms of thinking about the project. I also needed time to think harder about the point I was trying to make about fabulousness and what it does. And I got there by seeing fabulousness in real time. So that means in the nightclubs of Dalston, on the streets of East London, on the night bus, that circus of humankind, and sometimes in little glimpses in Soho, for instance. So in the book, I tell a story of fabulousness as a complicated way that marginalized folks turn to creativity, ideas, and imagination in order to assert ourselves in worlds and spaces that rigorously dehumanize us every single day. People always ask if the book will make them fabulous, if they read it and somehow they reemerge anew. And the point that I always want to go back to is that if somehow you realize the way in which you've been suppressing yourself, and you realize that norms have that don't have you in mind in the first place have led you to be a certain way that perhaps isn't how you would choose to be, then that is kind of what I'm after here. And nearly every interview that I did in the course of writing the book talks about this turning point where they got bored and fed up with trying to fit into norms that didn't have them in mind. So again, I'm reminded of Joseph Bean, making ourselves from scratch. So these are just a few images, fun images that I put together to share with you a bit the journey of the book, how it came together. So here I am in New Haven, seeing the cover of the book for the first time, like in my hands. My editor tried to explain to me that it would be metallic, you know, that the lips are metallic and that it kind of dances a little bit when you shake it. But it doesn't come across in a PDF or on paper, so I didn't get it. And I still didn't get it even now. Then the sort of Rolodex of pink and blue is I was able to choose the end papers. So the front end paper is gray and the back one is pink or teal. I don't remember anymore. Yeah, blue. So I was able to choose those, and I feel very excited about that. The press was very interested in making sure the book was well designed. This is a PDF that I got, one of the PDFs of the kind of finished jacket copy. I was so excited about the email subject heading here. I can tell you it's not the cover that I had in mind. Not that I love it now, but when they initially sent me this, I was like, I don't really know, I'm not sure. I didn't imagine a pair of lips as the cover of the book. But I started asking my friends, and everyone loved it. So it went ahead. And there were a lot of design decisions as part of this process, from like, should it be all caps? Should it be lowercase? Should it be pink? Should it be blue? What should be, you know, what's the narrative here? This is an important image. So this is the author photo for the book. You can see it here in the dust jacket just on the left side. This is an important image because this is, when I was living in London, this is the morning that I woke up and Agent Orange had been elected president. And I remember like staying awake and, you know, watching the news, you know, sort of the night before, hoping and praying that there would be some sort of something that would nudge and move or whatever. And I woke up, of course, to a barrage of text messages and tweets and Facebooks and WhatsApps and Instagrams and that he'd been elected. And so what did I do? I got out of my bed, put on my favorite pair of heels, got out my coconut oil, lotioned up, and took a selfie to say that he might be president, but I'm still here. And that my voice will not be erased because of that. So for me, in writing a book about style in this way, this was important to have this as the image. So just so you know that that's why it's there, and it's not just because of the shoes or whatever. Then some friends of mine helped me make a cute little video to do a little bit of promo, and I have to share it with you. We edited. So that was really fun to do. So from there, it's been quite a whirlwind. The book was reviewed in Tatler magazine. I was able to do a launch at Tate Modern with some of my favorite people, Victoria Sen and Oscar King, members of the kind of club scene, and Victoria is an amazing non-binary drag queen. A book launch at Gaze the Word, which is a legendary, iconic kind of queer bookshop in London. And it's really surreal to have seen it at Waterstones as a recommended title. Even here in Canada, I was able to be in the Globe and Mail style section. And I literally just got back from Australia last week, where I was talking about the work. So I bring all this into the room. I share with you this to say that this was fundamentally not easy to do. Choosing your own path is not easy. Writing your own story is not a cakewalk, and it do take nerve. The journey has not been easy without hiccups, bumps, and holdups. So this is from the book. Okay. This is a very personal book. There have been days in my life when I felt like an outsider, a black queer error, and it seemed like I couldn't go on without completely falling apart. I get bogged down by the stresses of living while black, working while black, and loving while black, but just when I felt like there was no way out of the depression, with its usual ebbs and flows, fashion and style were there to lift me up. A little turquoise sequin jacket here, a black floor-length maxi skirt there. Every day, fashion style helped me remember that my voice matters. I don't get dressed because I want to be stared and pointed at on the subway or while walking down the street. I would love to live in a world where I could wear whatever I wanted without getting verbally harassed or followed or fearing for my safety. But that's not the world we live in. Our world constantly reminds me that I shouldn't exist, so I dress the way that I do to scream that I am here. Style lets me tell you about my vision of the world and my dreams for the day, even if the structures that produce my depression don't evaporate just because I'm wearing my favorite sequin jacket. At least I can wear it and say to myself, today is going to be a good day. So the book came out at the high, this was a high moment of excitement around a book coming out, but also a low end in terms of having to leave London, being on the academic job market, and absolutely having no idea what was going to happen, if I was going to have a job or where I would be, that kind of state of panic. So I say all of this just to offer kind of context and a framework for how it all came to be. Oh yeah, I said framework. I didn't even plan to say that, but snap. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is the politics of style and what it means to see style and getting all dressed up as a politic for trans people, queer people, and people of color. In conversations about fashion and politics, I'm always confused by folks who say, I just don't care about fashion. I couldn't care less about what I put on my body. And it's true. You may not ever think about what you wear or care about what you put on today, but know this. When you can afford to say you just don't care about fashion, then you might actually also have the privilege of blending in, of knowing that your soul isn't being crushed by an immense pressure to pretend to be someone you're not. You've got the privilege of being below the radar and going undetected, unnoticed, unbothered, that is safe. Whether you care about fashion or not, and style or not, whether you invest in style as a politic or not, know that every outfit you wear, every look you serve is a message. An argument not only for the way you see yourself, but also how you want others to see you and how you imagine the world. So I said that the question for me is, how are art and beauty created in states of duress? Well, for me, we only talk about black and brown bodies when we're dying, not when we're thriving and getting life. So this is also why I am so committed to politics of optimism, of creativity, of aesthetics, and of uplifting beauty. What is it that leads to such freeing, eye-opening, beautiful, and transformative aesthetics and experiences? Sorry, what is it about duress that leads to such freeing, eye-opening, beautiful, and transformative experiences? So what you're seeing here on the screen is an image of a Vogue ball, sort of, not Vogue ball, really like a Vogue exhibition that took place at the Philadelphia Museum of Art this past January. The ball was in celebration of the museum's exhibition, Fabulous Fashion, curated by Christina Howland, which is really an exploration of Philadelphia kind of patrons of couture, as well as a few Philadelphia designers, and yeah, basically kind of society kind of world. And it's a great exhibition from Dior's New Look to now, and they wanted to kind of animate the exhibition by having a set of events. And so the Vogue Ball, so that is inviting queer and trans people of color in Philadelphia to speak, I guess, with their bodies and style about the work that they do. The group is called the Posse Project, and they are a HIV queer youth-focused group in Philadelphia. So I want to play another video. This is not the same one that we just saw, and I want you to just fall in. for me, this was quite a feat. I mean, the stairs are it's a very spectacular space. And so to see people kind of like glide with elegance and virtuosity down the stairs, in stilettos, by the way, without missing a beat, or if missing it, wrapping into the performance. For me, that is really, I kind of like saw that and thought about the stairs as a metaphor for the daily oppression and kind of obstacles that get in the way for like Black and brown bodies, but that how through aesthetics, through performance, through style, it's, I don't want to use the word overcome, but it's pushed aside. I don't see any stairs, do you? Right? And so that's kind of, for me, the kind of mood of this performance. I don't see any stairs, you know, and she's working it. So these ideas are some that I explore in Fabulous, which is really about the joy of getting all dressed up. I take you on a journey through nightclubs in New York, London, and Berlin, Vogue balls, catwalks. We also talk about street fashion. It merges autobiography. I said it right that time. So my own personal journey with interviews with a range of fabulous people, from Suzanne Bartsch to Von Allure and Lysandra Ninja. These are two folks who appear in the book, both in interviews and images throughout the book. On the left is the French pop star Kitty Smile. If you don't know his music, get into it right now. He is also a voguer and part of the House of Mizrahi, and is quite known for his runway kind of presentation. And by the way, this look he's made on his own. So the pants, everything, he's like made on his own. And I love the stance of this image. You know, it's like, get into it, right? On the other hand is Carolyn Cooper, who is one of the leading scholars of Jamaican dancehall culture. She teaches at the University of the West Indies. And when we were talking through the book, she told me that folks in her department say, you know, Carolyn Cooper, you should stop wearing fancy clothes. You should stop kind of caring about fashion and write serious papers. And you should write books, and you should sort of, you know, be going to conferences. And she said, well, but I am writing papers. I am teaching, I am going to conferences. And so there's this idea of that somehow if you are thinking about fashion, or if you care about fashion, or if you are invested in artifice, then somehow you're not serious. And so what I show you here are just, first of all, that beautiful eccentrics are everywhere, and that these are two examples, one on the one hand who makes his own works and is part of the voguing scene, and the other, a Black woman who is working in a university structure that is not taking her labor seriously, perhaps, because of the fashion piece. Probably the most important thing I learned in the process of writing the book is that we start to feel exhausted, stressed, and even anxious the more we suppress who we would really like to be. With fabulousness, there's always this kind of turning point, a moment when folks give up on trying to fit in and decide to choose themselves at last. And I really like this phrase, choosing yourself at last, knowing as well the risks that may come with choosing yourself at last. Fabulousness is about style as protest, about really happily failing at norms that are not made for you anyway, right? So, of course, when you write a book about fabulousness, as I've said, people ask, will it make you fabulous? Will you read this book and suddenly you reemerge anew? I guess if you think about how you police yourself, you know, how many of you have said, I can't wear that, or have friends who, you know, who've said, oh, I could never be seen dead in that, I couldn't wear that. And whenever I get asked this, whenever I hear this question, I always say, well, who is actually saying you couldn't wear this? Give me their phone number, let me send them an iMessage. You know, if you can realize how you police yourself, that's fabulous. Fabulous people realize that norms are not created with them in mind anyway, so it's really full of stories of people who failed. It's really a book about failure, actually. People who failed and chosen a different path. This is why, for me, fabulousness is, say, less about a particular style or look and more means of giving up on years of play acting, make-believe, and pretending to follow the rules. It's about the journey of giving up on norms, choosing to be different as an act of protest, taking the risk of being a spectacle when it's easier to blend in, and how all of these are, in fact, negotiated look by look, day by day, hookup by hookup. Through style as protest, I'm talking about a conscious decision to clock out of the norms and systems and algorithms that privilege the fascism of normativity and norm policing. So this is work that's about what happens when you create yourself every day while living in a state of duress and unrest. That state of emergency is existing within racist, heteronormative, homonormative, and other oppressive systems and structures that constantly wipe out and erase your body, presence, and creative labor. So here's a question. When you are brown, queer, and marginalized, what does it mean to be radically yourself? How do you storyboard daily life? What are the choices you make to get through the everyday? So here now I'm arriving at a kind of politics of fabulousness. By fabulous, I'm talking about a spectacular appearance that relies on really a storytelling practice and also a poetics of the self that is largely practiced by brown, queer, and other marginalized bodies. Now this approach to fabulousness builds on an anthropologist called Martin Menelanson, who uses the term fabulosity as a process of ethical self-making. He describes it as ethical self-making. So indeed, the fabulous creative act allows in how marginalized people transform aspects of themselves they've been taught to suppress or loathe or hate, and how that is transformed into art, ideas, and performance, though not without risk. The politics of fabulousness centers on an alternative world-making process. It's a poetics of the self that takes into account the myriad and various personal risks and aesthetic choices folks make as they attempt to express themselves in worlds and spaces that tirelessly suppress them. It's ultimately about style and creativity as a survival tactic as well as a politic. One of the questions I get asked a great deal, or at least in the early version of the work, isn't fabulousness just about gay men doing femininity? And this is something that I brought up with Alok Vaid-Menon, who appears in an interview in the book, the performance artist. And here is what they said. And so as we talk about kind of like, you know, be who you are, just do what you do, girl, we have to also think about, yes, oh, I got some more, you'll hear them. But you know, that, you know, do what you do, like, but it also kind of opens up the power of norms and how people feel afraid to even step out, even in the smallest way. And that's what we want to, I think, work to undo. Or that, like, you know, and if there is something about kind of gay and femininity, there isn't something wrong with that. We shouldn't like pathologize that. We shouldn't kind of police those people who are circulating the way they want to. So I want to just, in terms of the topic of like ending gender and thinking about like this idea that Alok puts forward, like how do we end gender, right? We can see this in some ways that are some sort of designers and spaces are attempting to try this in some way. It's not particularly new, but there's something, you know, going on in the moment. So, of course, a few looks. Here, Paloma, Spain, fall 19. There's a studio, a fashion house, kind of design house in Berlin called UI Studio, and their collections are basically everything is black or red or some kind of like pop color, but they don't design for gender. And you also have Stefano Pilati's new label, Random Identities, which is also kind of genderless in a way. He doesn't design for men or women. He designs clothes based off of kind of club kids kind of in Berlin. Then we have the fashion or the shoe brand, my favorite, you know, Cyro, who makes shoes for larger feet. And then, of course, we have this space, the Fluid Project in New York City, which says it is the world's first gender-neutral store. And I love what they're doing, and I want to put an asterisk on that and just say that the last time that I was there, it still felt quite binaristic. You had all of the kind of fabulous clothes on one side and the kind of normative clothes on the other. So it was still quite a, you know, divide. So, you know, just to put an asterisk there. Then there are other spaces. So this is Opulence, a kind of queer techno party and kind of art collective that I run with some friends in London. And we try to create a space that is femme-centered, that links fashion, techno, and queerness, that's about kind of queer world making, not only in terms of the images that we do, which are all shot by our art director, Jelly Louise. But we talk as a team about, okay, what's the mood? What are we doing? Who do we cast? Let's not have any, let's have different colors and sizes and ages, in fact. So from babies to quite older than that. So is it really a constant dialogue about how these worlds are created, how you shape them, not only in images. So, and these are some of the, this is like a flat, kind of promo for our parties, but also how it feels when you're in the space too. That basically that we try to create a space where basically mask for mask gets you nothing, lol. And where there are femmes in the DJ booth and as well as on the dance floor. So Opulence is a queer techno world that centers marginalized people in the DJ booth and on the dance floor, bodies that are all too often, all too easily, and all too frequently ditched from narratives about clubs, nightlife, and dance music. In reclaiming dance music from the straight white male narrative, Opulence is part of a global community of queer parties that are working to create sex-positive queer spaces with great dance music. So one critic who's been really generative for my thinking about fabulousness is the writer T.L. Cohen, in particular, her Glitter Festo. And if you haven't read this, I really encourage you to have a look at it. It's called the Glitter Festo. It's accessible online. And in that bedazzled manifesto of the politics of style, glitter becomes a tool of political opposition. We tend to think that political action or activism only looks like marching in the streets with sort of witty protest signs, screaming into bullhorns. And what I argue is that style, especially spectacular style, as is practiced by marginalized bodies, is also and doubly a form of protest as well as an assertion of agency. So for Cohen, glitter is kind of an aestheticized politics of action. I mean, think about it. You throw it, you can never get it off. It's everywhere. It's there. You take a shower, you take 5 showers, it is there 10 weeks later. So for her, this is really about how glitter sticks, how it disorients, how it creates a kaleidoscope, and how it also disrupts systems of power. She says, glitter, this is a quote, creates a space where white supremacy and male supremacy are rendered ridiculous. That's where I want to be. So how I build on her is that glitter is a material of fabulousness. So throwing metaphorical and even actual glitter in the face of white supremacy, racism, transmisogyny, and other systems of power asserts agency and presence even in a state of emergency. Glitter shows how marginalized people create art and beauty in a state of duress. So in a few moments, I'll take you to a tiny, soon-to-be-extinct music venue on the Lower East Side of New York City called The Stone. There, the legendary violinist Amadeus Leopold illustrates fabulousness as an urgent seizing of space through queerness, style, and performance. For me, Amadeus Leopold is an aesthetic fugitive who has tried to remain radically themselves while simultaneously operating within a traditional system, so the classical music industry, that doesn't necessarily make space for the kind of interdisciplinary kind of art that they do. So full context, I should tell you that I spent 20 years as a classical violinist. At 13, I bought my first CD with my allowance my grandmother gave me. This was it. A violinist called Hilary Hahn. I got on the bus to the local street side record shop, found a recording of unaccompanied Bach sonatas and partitas for violin recorded by her. And I think the CD probably cost like $17.99 or something, which was a lot of money to me then. And I'd already been training on the violin from the age of 5, but it was when I saw this particular recording of Hilary Hahn, who was 16 at this age, so only 3 years older than I was, that I decided I wanted to be her. I wanted to be a concert violinist. I never saw many other Black, queer, or gender nonconforming violinists in the classical music world. So for the next decade, I sort of thought that I could become one of them. When I first heard Amadeus Leopold in 2011, almost 6 years after I left the violin world, I thought he was absolutely the T. I thought about my 13-year-old self and wondered what it would have been like to have had Leopold as a model and possibility instead of Hilary Hahn. I will never forget the day I saw the Juilliard-trained queer violin virtuoso Amadeus Leopold live in concert. It was his first downtown show at a tiny experimental venue in New York City called The Stone, a special performance that was handpicked by Lou Reed and Laurie Anderson. Now, Leopold went to Juilliard and studied with Itzhak Perlman, who's one of the legendary violinists, and circulated around the experimental theater, classical music, and fashion and art worlds in New York. He made a splash for his virtuosity and thrilling sense of performance, fashion and creative strangeness, seeing no boundaries between the art disciplines in that kind of Warholian way. Leopold took classical music from Alice Tilly Hall to MoMA and from the catwalk to the nightclub. That evening at the Stone, I understood the queerness of the work that they are doing, because I too spent 20 years as a violinist in music conservatories, summer camps, orchestras, quartets, recitals, and violin competitions. Not only were there interpretations of violin pieces like Pablo de Sarasate's Zigeunerweisen eye-popping, but his creatively strange looks, so the ice cream swirl of hair, the dramatic makeup around the eyes, always a new look for every, even sometimes outfit changes in performance, red ankle boots. All this added an extra surge of creativity to the spectacle, a kind of Grace Jones meets Paganini. In an interview I did with Leopold that was published in Interview magazine in 2011, I asked about how fashion fits into their art, expressing themselves through fashion and how this impacted the overall experience of the performance. Here's what they said. The shoes and everything I wear is really part of the art. It's not an option for me to take them off. So I changed tactics and asked if it was difficult to play a string of 64th notes, which are some of the fastest notes you can play on a violin in wedged heels. It is a struggle, they said. By confessing how much fashion means to them as a queer artist and how fashion is just as much a part of the art as the music, Leopold underscores a key point the drama critic by the name of Charles McNulty once made about the pleasure of queer performance. To be queer, McNulty said, is to be noticed, to be considered odd, eccentric, to communicate difference, perform it, and reveal it as fashion. Passing as conventional is a cinch, but how boring. In a 2012 Today Show interview, Leopold described themselves as a performance artist who speaks through the language of the violin, welding together theater, fashion, dance, and classical music. When asked about the traditional classical music audiences, Leopold remembered, I think that classical music world has sort of been taking a nap, and I'm here to wake them up. People said, you can't go to Carnegie Hall looking like this. But when you are queer, of color, and non-conforming, what does it mean to look like this? Queer and gender non-conforming people, especially when they are doing fabulousness, are often reduced to this or that by homophobes and transmisogynists while simply walking down the street. What is that, they'll say, not even a human being, a thing. The movement through space, while queer and fabulous, also points to why I position fabulousness as small-scale political action, where getting from point A to point B and getting there safely is not always certain. And kind of the thing that I always say about fabulousness when I'm trying to explain to people is that it's about, who can get a sandwich. Some people can leave this room right now, go pick up a sandwich from, I don't know, whatever, Balzac or whatever, Balzac's? Get a sandwich from there and be totally fine, unnoticed, and unbothered. Others cannot make that journey without being harassed verbally, physically, or even, yes, digitally. And so for me, thinking about that journey, about who can get a sandwich, that really, for me, sums up what fabulousness is and the political stakes of style. Leopold told me how important it is for them to be radically themselves. They said, my parents, everybody would tell me that I'm a boy, I have to act this way, you can't wear these things, you can't put on makeup. And so for me, fashion and the visual representation of myself become a way to claim self-love. Every time I put on lipstick, I drape myself, I become my own self rather than what everybody else would rather have me be. Here, Leopold shows how fabulousness is a conversational form of self-presentation, a queer practice of everyday life that brown, queer, and other marginalized people use to protect some form of autonomy in their everyday experience. So for me, Leopold pinpoints the kind of queer worlds that I'm talking about. I mentioned opulence and how opulence is a way that we, my sort of friends and I, are trying to create a kind of fashion, femme-centered techno space. And with Leopold, you see the kind of world that they're also trying to create, one that blends fashion and classical music and virtuosity, as well as theater and performance art. So these kinds of things point to aesthetic fugitives who operate in a kind of parallel universe, in a way of kind of making yourself space as much as you can in classical music, but doing so on your own terms. The stakes of fabulousness are that at the same time that brown, queer, and trans bodies express, feel good about, and expand themselves through performance, that joy is subject to surveillance and condemnation and torture and ridicule and erasure by homonormative, heteronormative, misogynist, transmisogynist, patriarchal systems and institutions. The fabulous creative act lies in how marginalized snatch back aspects of themselves they've been taught to suppress and turn it into art. These are the political stakes of fabulousness. It isn't about simply looking great and feeling gorgeous. It's always a set of aesthetic principles engaged by people who take the risk of being a spectacle to stretch out and expand when it would be much easier, though no less toxic, to renounce themselves. This work is resolutely optimistic, and I intend to double down on this optimism. You know, I'm really sick of the way that media only talk about Black and brown bodies, as I said earlier, when we're dying, under attack, arrested, but not when we're slaying the category, snatching wigs, dancing our asses off, and feeling fab. Here, I agree with the Black feminist performance scholar Francesca Royster, whose work on Black eccentricity paves the way, for me at least, for thinking about how Black artists use creative agency to make a space for themselves when a place isn't always necessarily given. So for Royster, she talks about this idea of how the eccentric pushes the edges of the present to create language not yet recognized. So she says that the eccentric is creating new sounds and new dances and new ways of being in the world, new configurations of self. Fabulousness is a real-time cultural theory. A real-time cultural theory that privileges possibility and impossibility and creative expression over victimhood. So these are sort of the ideas that I explore in Fabulous. Put my shoes on now. So I want to tell you another story about another set of what I think are aesthetic fugitives. This time in a Vogue ball in Paris. So you all know what voguing is, right? Or do you know what voguing is? Raise your hands. So this is a Black and Latinx queer and trans underground world of fantasy that is an important part of performance history. Not only pop culture, not only sort of popular music, and not only dance, but performance art history itself. It has influenced pop stars and contemporary performance and dance artists from Madonna to Rashad Newsom, and artists from F.K. Twigs to the dancer Trajo Harrell. At its heart, voguing is a language and culture that transforms high fashion, or at least the tropes of it, into dance. But that's not all. There are multiple categories in voguing, and these are just a few of them. So this is an image from the Berlin Voguing Out Ball. I don't remember the year, maybe 2016. And here are 3, 6, 8 categories, right? So bizarre, which is what this image is a category where you're given so basically for every category you're given a prompt or sort of a prompt, and you're supposed to respond to that through fashion, through your performance. So in this bizarre category, we have Taya, who's in the gold, in the silver in the middle. She created this like cage, made of mattresses, and fixed herself in it and painted herself, and that was her kind of bizarre look. So then there's also floor performance, which is about using the space of the floor. So if you watch Vogue videos on YouTube or whatever, and you see people get on the floor as part of their performance. That is considered, that is called floor performance. Hand performance is everything that's having to do with the hands. So it's not really dancing like as such, but it's about telling a story with your hands. Then Butch Queen Up in Pumps, which is, Butch Queens are cisgender gay men who perform or walk in heels, in high heels. Vogue Femme is the Vogue everyone loves, which is the kind of duck walk and the shablams and the whole kind of thing everyone loves, which is about bringing all the elements together. So hand performance, floor performance, catwalk, duck walk. Old Way is about angles and kind of lines, really thinking about kind of Egyptian hieroglyphics. New Way is about I don't have any bones and I can just bend in ways you can't imagine. And Runway is about, which we'll talk about today, just now, is about selling a story on the runway and just be, I don't know how to say this, but just being that bitch. That's all it is. That's what it is. So what all these categories have in common is fabulousness as a practice of storytelling. You know, the MC often, or the commentator at a ball will often say, tell me a story. Tell me a story in the middle of the performance as they're chanting. And the final pose is what makes the performance pop. So Voguers are assessed by a panel of judges. So as you walk individually or by twos down the catwalk, you know, you have a panel of at least 3 people who give you a score. And it's not like, I mean, you can't get like an 8. Everyone has to give you a 10. If one person doesn't, you know, choose you, you're out. You get what's called chopped. So you have to absolutely have a kind of unanimous 10s across the board, as the phrase goes. So people who are walking in this category are walking and being judged by this panel. They're waiting to get their 10s, and if they do, they can continue to compete. And often, and usually when you win, there is, say, a trophy or a certificate, or also money, coins, cointadas. So as an example of this, come with me to Paris in February 2017, the scene of the chaotic Kiki Ball. So I was there at this ball doing research on the Parisian ballroom scene, and what I remember most about it was this particular runway category that I'm going to show you, because many of the Voguers brought really surprising, dramatic twists to the runway that you couldn't see coming. So what I love about the runway and the runway category is that it's about somehow pinching the kind of staple or the zip of the fashion industry, so the catwalk, and transforming it into a space that is not about selling garments to buyers, department stores, or even an industry, but in fact, as a utopian gesture centered on queer world making and the seizing of space and agency and creativity and fabulousness. All right, so I'll play the 2 videos now. They're each like a minute long, I think. And while you watch, I'd like you to kind of like focus on the attitude and how they take up the space. In particular, the second video, which is a battle, so they've already kind of advanced to the kind of last round. Just look at how they play off of each other in the second video. So you see she got her 10s. Okay, so here is, now that Mermaid has made it, you see that they got their 10s across the board, and so they've made it, and so now here they are battling for the prize. And one of the things that people often bring up when talking about kind of voguing and the kind of competition aspect of it especially is this thing of competition, that they're competing against each other for a prize or sort of notoriety. But you sort of said it, that really it's about competing against you. Like, what are you gonna do to raise yourself up to the next level in the performance? And you see people, everybody hugs at the end, it's you know, but it's about what are you gonna not only bring to the table, but put on the table? And this is the point that Lysandra Ninja makes in her interview that appears in the book. So there are kind of three things I wanna share with you that are, I think, interesting about this clip. So the first is the immediacy of the catwalk. You've talked about energy already, right? So voguers only have a few seconds to perform and draw the audience and judges into your world. So each time they pose, each time they walk, they are in a world and they're trying to bring you in. Come on with me, right? And that immediacy points to the urgent nature of fabulousness, I think. I agree with the queer critic, Jose Munoz, who felt that there is something Black about waiting and there's something queer and Latino and transgender about waiting. Not waiting, that is doing it now, loudly in the streets and in the club, is the practice of fabulousness. As a queer aesthetic, fabulousness is not about waiting for permission or asking for permission or even holding on long enough for the right time. It is absolutely a survival strategy about seizing space, time and presence, not later, but now. Because when you exist in a state of emergency, tomorrow is not a guarantee. The second aspect of the video I'd like to draw on is the call and response. So again, that talks about the energy in the room. So the call and response between not only the voguers, but also the audience who, you know, do this moment, who cackle at them, who leap out of their chairs and wave their fingers. This is all to say, to place call and response firmly within, or voguing and call and response firmly within the Black diaspora performance histories, where call and response is a thing you will find in much of Black diasporic performance and art. When voguers what the voguers do on the runway, how they pose, how they move, has a measured impact on the energy in the room. The audience give the energy back to the catwalk in a feedback loop that makes the voguer feel their performance and the moment even more. One of the most repeated phrases at a Vogue ball is "hold that pose for me," which you heard many times towards the end of this. An indication to performers that their performance time is kind of coming to an end, that it's about to end, so what are you gonna do to kind of like put the bow on your performance? And in a series of Facebook status updates called Ballroom Tings, veteran DJ and voguing pioneer Von Allure articulates the meaning behind the phrase, "holding that pose." Here's what he said. "Almost everything in ballroom is a snapshot. The final pose to your performance is your exclamation point, end of scene. It's catching a moment in time to see if you can put the whipped cream on top of your performance. Hold it, seal it." I'm reminded here of the art critic Craig Owens, who once observed that to pose is to present oneself to the gaze of the other as though one were already frozen, that is, already a picture. To pose is to present yourself as though you were already a picture. I've always found that phrase fascinating from when I read it 10 years ago as a graduate student. And it stuck, that phraseology has stuck with me until now. But is there something queer about the pose? Is there something queer about the catwalk? And how do catwalks facilitate, enable, or frame queer performance? So then the third and kind of final point I'd like to make about the clip is that it's on YouTube, so it has to do with the physicality of the thing. So it used to be that balls where you had to know about them, you had to be invited. Now you can watch from your television in your pajamas with popcorn. You can watch on Facebook Live, you can video Facebook Live, and you can also find the ball later that you couldn't make and watch it on YouTube. So this is something that has definitely changed how we can experience this culture in particular. The other thing is that, how many of you have heard about and or seen Paris is Burning? Paris is Burning? This is the kind of canonical visual text of voguing in ballroom by the director Jenny Livingston. It is regularly taught in queer studies and performance studies and theater studies and fashion studies and film studies courses. And I'm gonna throw a little bit of shade, but Paris is Burning is a fascinating piece, but I find that the zeroed in intellectual focus only on Paris is Burning as sort of like the only text that is about ballroom actually eulogizes an otherwise vibrant culture, locking it in a time capsule that's trapped in the 90s rather than approaching it as the vital global culture it is today. So we have shows like Pose, for instance, which feature a lot of the girls who are in the ballroom scene, like including Jack Mizrahi and Leomi and others. What would happen if instead of talking about Paris is Burning, we engaged with, say, things like Kiki or Facebook Live? And what if we taught YouTube channels and ballroom TV, Paris Ballroom TV, instead of Paris is Burning only? So I just challenge you to think about this, perhaps in your next classes, if this comes up, to bring up other examples of voguing and ballroom and maybe compare, sort of what are the kind of film techniques that you see, or how is the narrative different from Paris is Burning versus what you might see on Paris Ballroom TV on YouTube, or find someone's Facebook Live of a ball and compare the two. It could be an interesting discussion to have. You ready? Framework. Okay. So now I'd like to share with you my own journey to fabulousness, which started here in Ferguson, Missouri, a working class black suburb in the north of St. Louis, Missouri. There was nothing particularly notable or even striking about Ferguson at the time, but of course it has now come to represent the death of black bodies, police brutality, and anti-blackness in the United States. In fact, this Quick Trip gas station on West Florissant Avenue that was burned to the ground as an act of protest was not only minutes from my house, but it was also the site of an apartment complex where my uncles, cousins, and various other members of my family lived at one point or another. That is a stone's throw from where Mike Brown's body laid for dead. As kids, we would go to this Quick Trip to buy candy and bubble gum and Red Hot Riplets, which is a spicy, like rippled barbecue potato chip. If you go to St. Louis, get them, they're amazing. So when I look back at this Quick Trip and think about the fact that I'm a product of this community, what comes to mind is the Quick Trip as a site of protest, not only for those struggling through the enduring legacies of white supremacy, but also my own queer protest as a black faggot. And I say that term with love. I identify more as a faggot than I do as a gay man. I remember being called faggot all the time on the walk to and from this Quick Trip because I was simply too fabulous. I didn't realize that each time I took that walk to the Quick Trip, I was also seizing my own space, reclaiming my time. Nobody said, aw. This is an early photo of me with my grandmother, Grandma Moore, who raised me in Ferguson. The sort of Sears family portrait that was de rigueur in the early 1980s. I remember this particular photo because I hated what I was wearing, and I actually remember kicking and screaming and making a fuss at the Sears, not wanting to do the photo at all, but Dolores Moore was not having it. The photos were paid for, booked, and confirmed, so there was no way out. To calm me down, I got a spanking, and that's why I have a frown. I don't know if you see a frown, but I see a frown because I remember getting a spanking at the Sears in front of at this photo place. So learning what I hated wearing created space for me to figure out how to wear what I love as an act of resistance. And this is what I want you to think about today, how wearing what you love is also an act of resistance. Now, Grandma Moore subscribed to a particular kind of Black respectability politics where neither of us was allowed to look messy or unkempt in public. Here, we can think about Maxine Powell, who was a Black American socialite etiquette teacher who taught grooming, poise, and social graces to the Motown acts of the 1960s, most principally the Supremes. Miss Powell always said that she kind of prepared the Supremes and her Motown acts as though they were about to go to Buckingham Palace or perhaps even the White House, those two symbols of state power and white supremacy. But here, in this image, my grandmother and I, a respectable style was less about aiming for whiteness and more about asking for personhood. Black people have long been positioned against white beauty standards and seen as grotesque, inhuman, or just plain ugly. And so here, a respectable style is in fact a demand for humanity, a demand to be seen on equal terms. Look at her perfect bubble of soft brown hair, her tasteful gold earrings, delicate necklace, optimistic white blouse that altogether performs just the right amount of class. We didn't have much, but we always looked good, and I'm certain that what I know about style and the power of good style comes from Grandma Moore. Now, what I learned about style by being raised in a household of Black women is that style is how you announce yourself. Style is how you communicate to the world who you'd like to be today. Style is how you might hate your job, but you want to reclaim your time by going to the office in a fierce look. The difference between fashion and style is fashion is a system that tells us what we should buy and how we should present ourselves in order to succeed in life. Style is about how you choose you, how you become radically yourself in spite of the odds and the risks that come often from veering outside of the norm. So I'm reminded here again of that Joseph Beam passage that I shared with you earlier at the beginning. Style as a way of making yourself from scratch, as a reaction to oppression, a way of being perceived as less perceived especially when you feel unattractive. So a way of feeling attractive when you're deemed unattractive. We're not used to thinking about style as protest because style is an aesthetic. So it's of the body, it's sort of not of the mind, it's seen as frivolous, written off as excessive, as surplus, as unnecessary, frivolous. But if style is a reaction to oppression, what if we thought about fabulous style and these kind of aesthetic fugitives I've been talking about as a form of anger? Anger at the fact that if you're not white and male, the world just really is not your oyster. And then when you try to reclaim a small piece of agency in your life, the tiniest piece of agency, perhaps a Grace Jones inspired mesh gunmetal circle scarf, all you get is being called faggot and constantly undermined and catcalled and ridiculed and harmed in other ways. Meet Aunt Mildred, my grandmother's sister, and one of my earliest style frameworks. Okay, we're gonna do it again. Meet Aunt Mildred, my grandmother's sister, and one of my earliest style frameworks. I'd like us to think about framework as a way of thinking about the many and various templates, people, and cultural texts that allow queer people to discover other ways of being in the world. As I was coming to my own as a young queer sissy in Black St. Louis, Aunt Mildred always fascinated me because she dressed so differently from everyone else around me. When my grandmother wore pearls, wigs, and sequins and stayed committed to the politics of respectability, baby Aunt Mildred came ready. Ready. Every time she showed up to family functions, she looked like she was going to the club. Yes, she would storm family barbecues, birthday parties, Sunday dinners with tight leather pants, peep-toe stilettos, nail polish fresh, hair right, face beat, sequin top and shoulder pads for your life, a fur coat, just giving you what you need to see. Family would always joke with her, "Mildred, where are you going?" And that's the thing about fabulousness. Fabulous people are exhausted with the here and now, suffering under capitalism, transmisogyny, and white supremacy, so they are, in fact, in a hurry to find an elsewhere, someplace better than here. So for me, that's the main idea of fabulousness. When you see someone in a fabulous look, know that they are dressed out of this world because they are leaving it behind. Perhaps more than anyone else in my family, through her style choices, Aunt Mildred taught me how to be radically myself, one of my earliest style frameworks. I want to take a minute to recognize my Black femme ancestors, many of whom provided the framework for my own fabulousness. I started thinking about Black queer femme ancestors when I was scrolling through the Instagram one day and saw that Honey Dijon, a legendary DJ and trans woman of color, posted an inspirational quote that read, "You are your ancestors' wildest dreams." And it really made me think, because I do wonder what Josephine Baker and James Baldwin and Langston Hughes and Frankie Knuckles and Essex Hemphill and Joseph Beam and Willie Ninja and Venus Extravaganza would think about a television show like Pose, or if they could have ever imagined an artist like Lotic or Kitty Smile. Growing up as a queer kid, even if we come into our own queerness later in life, we're always on the hunt for possibilities. That's ultimately what a framework provides. That feeling of reading a book, listening to a song, and seeing an artist live their truth as a guide for how we might also want to live. When we don't find these possibilities in our immediate surroundings, we need to find them elsewhere. Men on Film, a comedy sketch that was part of the 90s Fox television series In Living Color, offered up some of the very first examples of queerness I'd seen as a kid. The sketch featured two film sissies, Blaine Edwards, played by Damon Wayans, and Antoine Merriweather, played by David Allen Greer, who offered up critiques of films, books, and other cultural texts, critiques that were almost always bulging with sexual innuendo. These queens were effeminate, talked with a lisp, and wore fabulous clothes, but as much as I loved seeing them on television, I also knew they were a warning of what not to be. The butt of their jokes was always that they're sissies, that men, especially Black men, are not supposed to be gay, let alone this gay. It's hard for me to separate the sketch from the fact that while watching it, some of my family would make disparaging remarks about gay people, about faggots, about sissies, while there was one sitting in the room. The idea that Black men are not supposed to be gay, that same-sex desire was invented by colonialism and is a white thing, is a philosophy that stretches back to certain strands of Black nationalist thought. And these are precisely the ideas that Men on Film kind of played into, which made being a closeted sissy even more nerve-wracking. But thank the Lord for Prince, a fabulous Black sissy who offered another framework for how to be in the world, a way of expanding restrictive ideals of Black masculinity. Prince was a funny one, because in my family and neighborhood, everybody loved Prince. You couldn't say nothing about Prince. My Uncle Burgo, a Baptist pastor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, loved him some Prince. Everybody loved Prince. What was confusing, though, is how it is that folks could love Prince and play his music and talk about how sexy he was, and at the same time dismiss the sissies of Men on Film. Was it because Prince insisted on heterosexuality? If that's the case, I'm not sure why people started calling me Prince as another way to say faggot. For as long as I can remember, people would call me Prince when I was at school or at the mall or walking toward or from the Quick Trip. And it's not as though they were trying to poke fun at me because I was wearing, say, straight hair, heels, and a scepter, which would have been cute. That would have been cute. No, they would call me Prince even if I was in sweats and from a very early age. So early, in fact, that I learned to associate Prince with faggotry, with being a sissy, much in the same way that in this current political climate in the United States, white men have uttered Trump at me as I pump past them on my way to a better, way more interesting place. I think, too, about other Black femme-style possibilities like Grace Jones and Anjali Antali, who brought their own tufted gold ottomans when there wasn't already a seat at the table. In her work on eccentric Black musicians, from Grace Jones to Michelle Ndegocello, Francesca Royster talks about how these artists use performance and the stage and fashion and eccentricity to not only expand notions of gender and race, but also that eccentricity is about seizing space on one's own terms. And she calls this, and I want you to remember this and think about this forever and ever and ever, the freedom to be strange. She's writing about the freedom to be strange. And this phrase captures precisely what it is to be radically yourself, this freedom to be strange, out of the norm, unlocatable, off the map, weird, a sissy. My early love for Prince was less about his music and more about his visual appeal. I was fascinated that he could be so out there and so queer. I always think that the 80s were like the best fashion decade. Maybe I'm just aging myself or showing my age, I don't know. Struggling with living at home and being in the closet, but also desperate to express myself, I remember at a certain moment making the decision to start dressing the way Prince did, to look to him as a framework. I mean, if these girls are gonna call me Prince as an insult, I might as well give them something to see. His style choices positioned him as a possibility for other Black queer folks, that maybe if you can look like Prince, you can also be the sissy you want to be, somehow an open secret, but loved all the same. This is anyway what I thought as a teen in the Midwestern United States. The thing about choosing the freedom to be strange is that you're never fully out and in the clear once and for all. It's not as though you make an announcement to the world once and that's that. Choosing an identity outside of the norm always involves a constant process of coming out again and again, a process that begins the second you leave the house and go to the grocery store or the mall or the club or meet new people, and every time you get on the bus or the subway and enter a new social or even digital space. What this means is that identity involves a process of negotiation where you navigate and modulate how much of yourself to reveal in any given situation. For people choosing the freedom to be strange, this involves a protective kind of strategic planning, and it does involve strategic planning. You decide that today, maybe you won't wear your favorite shoes because you've had enough with the harassment this week. And it means that going home for the holidays, and removing your nail polish and septum piercing so you don't even have to have that convo with mom and dad. Style is always on the move, not only rolling through physical space, but also changing and depending on the environment and your mental state. Like any identity category, style is not stable, but more of a question that asks, who do you have the energy to be today? So I want to tell you a little story. So a few days ago, or like a month ago, I texted a bunch of my friends because I needed help selecting the perfect selfie to put on Tinder. New year, new Tinder pic. Framework. I was wrestling between like two photos. One where I'm sort of more, I don't know, masculine presenting, scare quotes, and another, although perhaps not very, and one where I'm giving you a little bit something more to see. Now, photos always have an origin. And in one, I'm in one selfie, I'm on a boat in New Orleans, at the Prospect Art Fair, and in the other, I'm leaving my favorite nightclub after hours of dancing, like 12 hours of dancing, and feeling fab. I texted the photos to my friends and waited to hear back from the jury. But of course, I already knew which ones I wanted to use. I was just trying to get the permission to use them. So here are the pics. The blue pants are fab, one of my friends told me, but you're wearing sunglasses, so I like the one where we can see your face. Another friend, definitely the first one, the one on the left, he said before adding, you'll never get laid if you use the other. The statement struck so hard, the one about not getting laid, because I knew that even though that photo is the one I wanted to use, selecting it would ultimately get me ignored and undervalued, desexualized, blocked. I can't tell you how many times I've seen small-minded dating profiles with statements like no femmes or into white guys, and of course the ever elegant no blacks. When I use a femme photo, often people ask, are you masculine? And others would say, oh, you seem a bit femme, and? Gay misogyny is not new, with the marketplace of gay desire centered on the endless chase of a certain kind of hyper-stylized masculinity that isn't real. What's infuriating about gay misogyny is that to get laid or a match or to get noticed at all, as my friend texted, we often have to suppress feminine aspects of ourselves. This is, again, the question that Alok Vaid-Menon posed brilliantly as, what feminine part of yourself did you have to destroy to survive in this world? I'll say it again. What feminine part of yourself did you have to destroy to survive in this world? This is Alok Vaid-Menon saying that question. When you're fabulous, if you're not blocked, consider yourself lucky if you get a yes, queen, or a work, honey, but not love or a goodnight kiss. The faggot as a source of entertainment and desexualized objectification that can be traced at least to the early 1900s. Choosing fabulousness means choosing the PTSD that comes from realizing the photo you'd like to use, the photo that best captures how you'd like to be seen, how you feel, the world you're in, is the one that might get you nowhere. So you strategize, you plan, and you choose the one that will get you a match. You choose the one that will get you a first date. You strategize and you choose the look that will get you home safely. What I've articulated today, in closing, is fabulousness as a world-making practice that offers a creative response to living under duress. It is without question that brown, queer, and trans bodies live in a state of emergency every day. But what my research and teaching and creative practice is focused on is how we shapeshift, turning that status into path-breaking and generative creativity, art, music, and performance. This kind of world-making thinks about the non-traditional venues and locales and spaces off the map where queer performances are able to take space and flourish. And these are often nightclubs and cabarets and catwalks and music venues and other spaces. It is not because these spaces are better or more fun, but because often artistic and cultural institutions regularly exclude and even actively overlook artists working within kind of non-traditional means and forms. So in turn, these aesthetic fugitives are forced to reinvent what performance means to them, what style means to them, what a club night means to them, as a way to create their own spaces because there's not necessarily an institutional structure in place to value them and their work anyway. So in all of this, I'm interested in how people from the margins imagine, stage, and bring to life worlds of meaning, living physically in the now, but existing, in fact, in a parallel universe. I'd like us all to think about these locales off the map, those places without discernible GPS coordinates and at the fringes of disciplines and genres and venues and systems. Because I think it's there, in these spaces, in the crevices and at the fringes, where we find different spaces, new worlds, and other possibilities of emergence. Yes. So can I have you just get out of here? This is the end, but just as a way to end, can we just get out of our seats and kind of stretch and feel the floor? Thank you, everybody.